February 8, 1942, Northwestern Russia. The Demyansk region. Temperature -35 degrees Celsius. Snow fell continuously, reducing visibility to mere meters. Winds howled across the frozen landscape, creating drifts that buried entire vehicles. General Walter von Brockdorff-Ahlefeldt stood in his headquarters bunker, studying maps spread across a wooden table. The news was catastrophic. Soviet forces had broken through German lines north and south of his position. The breakthroughs were deep, perhaps 40 kilometers. Red Army mobile units were racing westward, attempting to link up behind the German salient. If those Soviet forces connected, Brockdorff-Ahlefeldt's entire command would be trapped. 6 divisions, approximately 100,000 wehrmacht troops, cut off from supplies, reinforcements, escape routes, surrounded in the depths of a Russian winter with temperatures that killed exposed flesh in minutes. The encirclement closed on February 8th. Soviet forces met west of Demyansk, completing a ring around the German salient. Radio communication with Army Group North headquarters confirmed the situation. 100,000 German soldiers were now isolated in a pocket measuring roughly 40 kilometers by 30 kilometers. Trapped, surrounded, seemingly doomed. This was exactly the scenario that had destroyed the German 6th Army at Stalingrad 12 months later. An entire Wehrmacht formation encircled by Soviet forces, cut off from supply, slowly ground down through attrition until forced to surrender. Military history suggested only one outcome for such situations: annihilation. But the Demyansk pocket would not follow the Stalingrad pattern. What happened over the next 72 days would establish a precedent that would influence German strategic thinking for the remainder of the war. It would demonstrate that modern airlift capacity could sustain an encircled force indefinitely. It would prove that Luftwaffe transport aircraft could deliver enough supplies to keep a surrounded army combat effective. It would also create a dangerous illusion. The success at Demyansk would convince Hitler and the German High Command that air supply could sustain any encircled force, regardless of size, distance, or opposition. This belief would contribute directly to the Stalingrad disaster when the Luftwaffe attempted to replicate the Demyansk operation on a much larger scale and failed catastrophically. But in February 1942, Stalingrad lay in the future. At Demyansk, German commanders faced an immediate crisis. 100,000 troops surrounded. Winter conditions that made overland supply impossible. Soviet forces tightening the ring. No relief force available to break through. Only one option remained: supply by air. General Brockdorff-Ahlefeldt calculated his requirements. 100,000 men consumed enormous quantities of supplies daily: food, ammunition, medical supplies, fuel, replacement equipment. The minimum daily requirement was estimated at 300 tons. That figure would increase if combat intensified or if casualties required medical evacuation. 300 tons per day was an unprecedented airlift requirement. No Air Force had ever attempted to supply an encircled force of this size over an extended period. The Luftwaffe possessed transport aircraft, primarily Junkers Ju-52 trimotors. But these planes had limited cargo capacity. Each Ju-52 could carry approximately 2 tons of supplies. Meeting the 300-ton daily requirement would necessitate 150 transport sorties every single day. Weather made the challenge even more daunting. Northwestern Russia in February experienced brutal conditions: snowstorms, fog, temperatures that froze aircraft hydraulics and engines. Visibility frequently dropped below minimum safe flying conditions. Airfields within the pocket were crude, often just cleared sections of frozen lake or field. Landing on snow-covered ice in a blizzard with a heavily loaded transport aircraft was extraordinarily dangerous. Soviet forces presented an additional threat. Red Army anti-aircraft batteries ringed the pocket. Soviet fighters patrolled the approaches. Any German transport attempting to reach Demyansk faced hostile fire throughout the flight. Slow, lumbering Ju-52s were vulnerable targets. Losses would be inevitable. Despite these obstacles, Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb, commanding Army Group North, ordered the airlift to proceed. The alternative was unacceptable. Abandoning 100,000 troops was politically impossible. Hitler had already demonstrated his unwillingness to authorize withdrawals or surrenders. If the Demyansk garrison could not be supplied, it would be destroyed, and the political consequences would be severe. Luftwaffe Colonel Fritz Morzik received orders to organize the airlift. Morzik was an experienced transport aviation officer, but even he recognized the magnitude of the challenge. Assembling sufficient aircraft would require stripping transport units from across the Eastern Front. Air crews would need to fly multiple sorties daily in appalling weather. Maintenance crews would struggle to keep aircraft operational in sub-zero temperatures. The entire operation would push men and machines to their absolute limits. Aircraft began concentrating at airfields surrounding the Demyansk pocket. Ju-52 transport planes arrived from Germany, from training schools, from other sectors of the front. Eventually, over 500 transport aircraft would be committed to the operation. This represented a significant portion of Germany's total transport aviation capacity. If the Demyansk airlift failed, or if substantial losses occurred, the impact on Luftwaffe capabilities across all theaters would be severe. Inside the pocket, conditions deteriorated rapidly. The encirclement was unexpected. German units had been engaged in offensive operations when Soviet counterattacks materialized. Supplies within the pocket were inadequate for a prolonged siege. Ammunition stocks were low. Food reserves would last perhaps 2 weeks at normal consumption rates. Medical facilities were overwhelmed with frostbite cases even before combat casualties were factored in. Soldiers dug into frozen ground, creating defensive positions around the pocket's perimeter. The soil was so hard that explosives were required to break through the frost layer before entrenchments could be excavated. Once dug in, troops faced the constant threat of frostbite, hypothermia, and death from exposure. Adequate winter clothing was scarce. Many soldiers lacked proper boots, gloves, or insulated coats. Frostbite casualties exceeded combat casualties during the operation's early weeks. The first airlift sorties arrived on February 9th. A handful of Ju-52s braved the weather to land on improvised airstrips within the pocket. Each aircraft carried desperately needed ammunition and medical supplies. The deliveries were woefully inadequate, perhaps 20 tons total, but they demonstrated that air supply was possible. Over subsequent days, the tempo increased. More aircraft arrived at the surrounding airfields. Flight schedules were established. Pilots learned the routes, the approaches, the peculiarities of landing on snow-covered ice. Ground crews developed techniques for rapid loading and unloading despite freezing temperatures. The airlift operation became increasingly efficient. By mid-February, daily deliveries approached 200 tons, still short of the 300-ton requirement, but enough to keep the garrison combat effective. Ammunition was prioritized. Soviet forces launched continuous attacks against the pocket's perimeter, attempting to reduce the encirclement through direct assault. German defenders needed constant resupply of artillery shells, mortar rounds, machine gun ammunition to repel these attacks. Food was rationed strictly. Soldiers received reduced rations calculated to maintain minimal combat effectiveness while conserving supplies. The reduction was severe. Many troops were constantly hungry, but starvation was avoided. Medical supplies allowed treatment of wounded and frostbite victims. Though facilities remained inadequate for the casualty volume, the airlift also enabled evacuation of wounded. Returning aircraft, having delivered supplies, could carry injured soldiers back to hospitals outside the pocket. This was crucial for maintaining morale. Wounded men knew they would receive proper medical care, rather than dying in field hospitals lacking equipment and medicine. The knowledge that evacuation was possible helped soldiers endure the horrific conditions. Soviet forces recognized the importance of disrupting the airlift. Anti-aircraft batteries intensified fire on approaching transports. Soviet fighters increased patrols along known flight routes. The Red Air Force lacked sophisticated radar or ground control systems, but visual identification in clear weather allowed Soviet pilots to intercept slow-moving Ju-52s. Luftwaffe losses mounted. January and February saw dozens of transports shot down or damaged beyond repair. Each lost aircraft represented not only expensive equipment, but also experienced crews. Transport pilots received limited training compared to fighter or bomber crews. Replacing casualties was difficult. As losses accumulated, remaining air crews faced increasing exhaustion, flying multiple sorties daily. The weather remained Germany's greatest enemy. Snowstorms could ground the entire transport fleet for days. When aircraft did fly, navigating to the pocket in blizzard conditions was extraordinarily difficult. Some transports became lost, crashed, or landed at the wrong airfields. Others successfully reached the pocket, but crashed on landing due to ice-covered runways or poor visibility. Ground crews within the pocket worked desperately to maintain operational airfields. Snow had to be cleared continuously. Ice accumulation on runways required constant attention. Damaged aircraft needed to be removed from landing areas. All this work occurred in temperatures that froze equipment and endangered personnel. Frostbite was epidemic among ground crews. Despite the challenges, the airlift continued. German organizational efficiency and Luftwaffe professionalism kept supplies flowing. Daily delivery tonnage gradually increased as more aircraft arrived and procedures improved. By early March, deliveries occasionally exceeded 300 tons. The pocket was being sustained, but sustainability was not victory. The garrison remained encircled. Soviet forces controlled all ground routes. Wehrmacht units outside the pocket attempted relief operations, but winter conditions and determined Soviet resistance prevented breakthroughs. Brockdorf-Ahlefeld's forces were surviving, but not escaping. Hitler issued orders that the pocket must be held. No withdrawal was authorized. The troops would maintain their positions until relief forces broke through or until ordered otherwise by the Führer himself. This inflexibility had military logic. The Demyansk salient tied down significant Soviet forces attempting to reduce the pocket. Those Red Army units were unavailable for operations elsewhere, but holding the pocket required continuous air supply. The Luftwaffe was sustaining an operation unprecedented in scale and duration. No air force had ever maintained such an intensive airlift for so long. The strain on aircraft, crews, and support personnel was immense. Inside the pocket, combat continued relentlessly. Soviet forces launched attack after attack, attempting to crack German defenses. Artillery bombardments preceded infantry assaults. German defenders, well supplied with ammunition thanks to the airlift, repelled most attacks with heavy casualties inflicted on Soviet forces. But each defensive battle consumed ammunition, fuel, supplies that required replacement via airlift. The defensive perimeter gradually contracted. Soviet pressure forced abandonment of outlying positions. German forces fell back to shorter, more defensible lines. This reduced the pocket's size, but increased the density of defending troops. More soldiers occupied less space, improving defensive strength, but also increasing daily supply requirements. Medical facilities struggled with the casualty flow. Combat wounds, frostbite, disease, exhaustion, all produced patients requiring treatment. Field hospitals within the pocket lacked adequate staff, equipment, medicine. Airlift evacuation helped, but seriously wounded soldiers often died before aircraft could transport them to proper hospitals outside the pocket. Morale remained surprisingly high despite the conditions. German soldiers endured because they believed relief was coming. The airlift proved the Luftwaffe could reach them. Supplies arrived daily. Wounded were evacuated. High command had not abandoned them. These factors sustained hope, even as weeks in the pocket stretched toward months. Soviet psychological warfare attempted to undermine this morale. Loudspeakers broadcast in German, urging surrender. Leaflets were fired into German positions, describing the futility of resistance and promising good treatment for those who surrendered. German commanders responded by emphasizing the airlift's success and the ongoing relief efforts. Most soldiers remained loyal, believing survival was possible if they held out. As February became March, the airlift achieved remarkable efficiency. Daily deliveries regularly exceeded 300 tons. Aircraft losses declined as pilots learned to avoid Soviet anti-aircraft concentrations, and as Luftwaffe fighters provided escort during critical portions of flights. The operation was working. An encircled force of 100,000 was being sustained indefinitely through air supply alone. This success began influencing strategic thinking at the highest levels. Hitler took personal interest in the Demyansk operation. If 100,000 troops could be supplied by air, then encirclement need not mean destruction. Future operations could accept the risk of isolation if air supply could maintain combat effectiveness. The Führer's faith in the Luftwaffe's capabilities grew. This confidence would have catastrophic consequences at Stalingrad. But in March 1942, such disasters lay ahead. At Demyansk, the airlift continued successfully. Spring approached. Temperatures rose slightly, though conditions remained brutal. The frost layer began thawing, turning frozen ground into mud. Airfield operations became more difficult as runways turned to slush. Relief operations outside the pocket finally began making progress. Wehrmacht forces launched coordinated attacks from the west, attempting to break through Soviet lines and establish a ground corridor to the surrounded garrison. These attacks benefited from improving weather and from Soviet exhaustion after months of failed attempts to reduce the pocket. By late March, relief forces had advanced within 10 kilometers of the pocket's perimeter. German commanders within the encirclement prepared for breakout operations to link up with approaching units. The end of the siege appeared imminent. On April 21, 1942, advance elements of the relief force contacted Demyansk garrison units. The encirclement was broken. A narrow corridor, only 3 kilometers wide, connected the pocket to German-held territory. It was tenuous, vulnerable to Soviet counterattack, but it existed. Ground supply could resume. The siege had lasted 72 days. From February 8th to April 21st, the Luftwaffe had sustained 100,000 encircled troops entirely through airlift. Approximately 65,000 tons of supplies had been delivered. Over 22,000 wounded soldiers had been evacuated. These figures represented an extraordinary accomplishment in military aviation history. The cost had been substantial. The Luftwaffe lost 265 transport aircraft during the operation, over half the number committed. Hundreds of aircrew died. Maintenance demands had worn down the transport fleet. Many surviving aircraft required extensive overhaul. Germany's airlift capacity was significantly degraded, but the operation was declared a success. The garrison had survived. The pocket had been held. German forces maintained control of the Demyansk salient. High Command praised the Luftwaffe's achievement. Hitler was convinced that air supply could sustain encircled forces indefinitely. This conclusion was partially valid but dangerously oversimplified. Demyansk succeeded due to several favorable factors. The pocket was relatively small, 40 by 30 kilometers, allowing concentration of airlift efforts on a few airfields. The garrison size, while large, was not impossibly enormous. Weather, though terrible, included enough flyable days to maintain minimum supply levels. Soviet anti-aircraft and fighter opposition, though significant, was not overwhelming. Most critically, the operation lasted only 72 days. The Luftwaffe sustained this intensive effort for 2.5 months by cannibalizing transport resources from across the theater. Sustaining such an operation for longer periods would have been problematic. Aircraft and crew fatigue, maintenance backlogs, and spare parts shortages would have imposed limits. None of these caveats registered strongly with German leadership. The lesson internalized was simple. Air supply works. Encircled forces can be sustained. Hitler would apply this lesson 9 months later at Stalingrad with catastrophic results. At Stalingrad, every favorable factor present at Demyansk would be absent. The pocket would be enormous, hundreds of thousands of troops requiring 750 tons daily. The distance from supply bases would be greater. Weather would be worse. Soviet opposition would be far more intense. The operation would need to last not 72 days, but months. The Luftwaffe would fail completely, and an entire German army would be destroyed. But in April 1942, Stalingrad was unimaginable. At Demyansk, success had been achieved. The operation entered Wehrmacht legend as proof that German military excellence could overcome any obstacle. The surrounded garrison had held. The Luftwaffe had delivered. Relief forces had broken through. Germany remained invincible. The reality was more nuanced. The Demyansk pocket succeeded despite enormous costs and favorable circumstances. The operation pushed German capabilities to their limits. Replicating the success under less favorable conditions would prove impossible. Inside the pocket, soldiers celebrated the relief. The 72-day ordeal was over. Ground supply convoys could now reach the garrison. Fresh troops, ammunition, food, medical supplies arrived via the corridor. Wounded could be evacuated overland. The nightmare of isolation had ended, but the celebration was premature. The corridor remained narrow and vulnerable. Soviet forces launched repeated attacks, attempting to sever the connection. German units fought desperately to maintain the lifeline. Combat in the corridor was intense throughout spring and summer 1942. The Demyansk salient itself remained a strategic liability. It protruded deep into Soviet-held territory, requiring constant defense against attacks from 3 directions. Holding the salient tied down German divisions that were needed elsewhere. Casualties continued mounting. Eventually, German High Command recognized the problem. In February 1943, nearly a year after the pocket was relieved, Hitler authorized withdrawal from the Demyansk salient. German forces evacuated the position, shortening their defensive lines. The salient that 100,000 troops had been encircled defending was voluntarily abandoned. This raised obvious questions. If the salient would eventually be evacuated, why had it been held at such cost? Why sustain 100,000 surrounded troops for 72 days, only to abandon the position months later? The answers were uncomfortable. Pride, prestige, Hitler's refusal to authorize retreats, German strategic inflexibility. The Demyansk pocket operation demonstrated both German strengths and weaknesses. The airlift showcased Luftwaffe professionalism, organizational skill, and technological capability. The garrison displayed courage, endurance, and discipline under horrific conditions. These were genuine accomplishments. But the operation also revealed strategic rigidity. The salient should have been evacuated before encirclement occurred. Once surrounded, the garrison could have attempted breakout rather than waiting for relief. The resources committed to the airlift could have been used more productively elsewhere. German command decisions were often driven by ideology and prestige rather than sound military logic. For the Soviet forces, Demyansk represented a frustrating failure. Red Army units had successfully encircled 100,000 German troops, precisely the type of operation that would destroy the Sixth Army at Stalingrad. But unlike at Stalingrad, the encirclement at Demyansk did not produce surrender. The Germans escaped. Soviet commanders learned lessons from this failure. Air supply was vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire and fighter interception. Future encirclement operations needed to include stronger efforts to interdict enemy airlift. When the Stalingrad encirclement occurred, Soviet forces applied these lessons, deploying extensive anti-aircraft defenses and fighter patrols that prevented effective German air supply. The soldiers who endured the Demyansk pocket carried memories of the experience for the rest of their lives. Survivors described the extreme cold, the constant hunger, the fear of Soviet breakthrough, the relief when aircraft arrived with supplies. Many suffered permanent injury from frostbite. All were marked psychologically by 72 days of isolation and survival. For Luftwaffe aircrew, Demyansk was a grueling ordeal, flying multiple sorties daily in terrible weather, facing anti-aircraft fire and fighter attacks, witnessing comrades shot down, struggling with exhaustion. The experience took a severe toll. Many pilots who flew Demyansk missions would later participate in the Stalingrad airlift, where they would face even worse conditions and higher losses. The technical lessons from Demyansk influenced Luftwaffe transport operations for the remainder of the war. Procedures for loading, flight planning, approach techniques, landing on improvised airfields, all were refined based on Demyansk experience. The operation provided a crash course in large-scale airlift logistics, but the strategic lesson that air supply could sustain any encircled force was dangerously wrong. Demyansk succeeded under specific, favorable circumstances that would not be present in future encirclements. Generalizing from this single case proved catastrophic. Historians have extensively analyzed the Demyansk operation. Some view it as a remarkable achievement demonstrating German military capability at its peak. Others see it as a wasteful effort that consumed resources for minimal strategic gain. Both perspectives contain truth. The operation was indeed a remarkable achievement. Sustaining 100,000 troops for 72 days entirely by airlift had never been done before. The Luftwaffe accomplished something unprecedented in military aviation. The crews, ground personnel, and planners who made it work deserve recognition for extraordinary professionalism under terrible conditions. But the strategic value was questionable. The Demyansk salient was eventually abandoned anyway. The resources committed, aircraft, fuel, aircrew, maintenance personnel, could have been used more productively elsewhere. The operation tied down German forces in a secondary sector, while more critical situations developed in other areas. Most significantly, Demyansk created a dangerous precedent. Hitler became convinced that encircled forces could always be supplied by air. This belief directly influenced the Stalingrad decision. When the Sixth Army was surrounded, Hitler ordered it to hold in place, confident the Luftwaffe could repeat the Demyansk success. The result was disaster. At Stalingrad, the Luftwaffe attempted to supply 250,000 troops, more than twice the Demyansk garrison. The distance from supply bases was greater. Weather was worse. Soviet opposition was far more intense. the Luftwaffe managed to deliver only a fraction of required supplies. The Sixth Army slowly starved and froze before surrendering in February 1943. The Demyansk success had created an illusion that air supply could solve any encirclement problem. This illusion killed hundreds of thousands at Stalingrad. In this sense, Demyansk's greatest impact on World War II was negative. It encouraged strategic decisions that led to catastrophe. For the 100,000 German soldiers who survived the Demyansk pocket, the experience was both traumatic and formative. They had endured isolation, winter, combat, and survived. Many would fight through the remainder of the war, carrying with them the knowledge that even desperate situations could be overcome through endurance and determination. The operation also demonstrated the importance of logistics in modern warfare. Military success depends not just on combat prowess, but on supply systems, transportation networks, and organizational efficiency. The Demyansk airlift was fundamentally a logistical operation. Its success proved that logistics, properly executed, could sustain combat power even under extreme circumstances. But logistics has limits. The Demyansk operation pushed those limits without exceeding them. At Stalingrad, the limits would be exceeded with catastrophic consequences. Understanding where those limits lie is crucial for military planning. Demyansk suggested the limits were farther out than they actually were. In the decades since World War II, air supply has become a standard military capability. Modern air forces routinely sustain isolated forces through airlift. The technology has advanced enormously. Larger aircraft, better navigation, all-weather capability, aerial refueling extending range. Operations that were desperate gambles in 1942 are routine today. But the fundamental challenge remains the same. Supplying encircled forces by air is difficult, dangerous, and resource-intensive. Success requires air superiority, adequate transport capacity, favorable weather, and vulnerable opposition. When any of these factors are absent, air supply becomes problematic or impossible. The Demyansk pocket stands as both an achievement and a warning. It demonstrated what was possible through determination, skill, and organizational excellence. It also revealed the limits of those capabilities and the dangers of overconfidence. 72 days, 100,000 troops, 65,000 tons delivered, 265 aircraft lost. The numbers tell a story of extraordinary effort and significant cost. The operation succeeded, but the success was fragile, dependent on circumstances that could not be guaranteed in future encirclements. For students of military history, Demyansk offers lessons about logistics, air power, winter warfare, and strategic decision-making. The operation repays careful study. The successes can be learned from. The mistakes can be avoided. The broader implications about limits, overconfidence, and the dangers of generalizing from single cases remain relevant. General Brockdorff-Ahlefeldt, who commanded the encircled garrison, survived the war. His handling of the crisis was considered competent. He maintained order, managed scarce resources, and kept his forces combat effective throughout the ordeal. After relief, he continued serving on the Eastern Front until war's end. Colonel Morzik, who organized the airlift, also survived. He would later be involved in planning the Stalingrad airlift, where his warnings about the operation's infeasibility were ignored. Morzik understood the limits of air supply better than most, having experienced them directly at Demyansk. His concerns about Stalingrad proved prescient. The Luftwaffe transport crews who flew the Demyansk missions suffered heavy casualties throughout the war. Many who survived Demyansk died in subsequent operations. Transport aviation was dangerous work, especially when conducted under combat conditions. The men who flew these missions rarely received the recognition afforded to fighter or bomber crews. but their contribution to German military operations was substantial. The Demyansk pocket operation concluded successfully in April 1942. The garrison was relieved. The corridor was established. Ground supply resumed. But the legacy of those 72 days extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. The operation influenced German strategic thinking, shaped Luftwaffe doctrine, and contributed to decisions that would cost hundreds of thousands of lives. In the frozen forests of northwestern Russia, 100,000 German soldiers had survived against terrible odds. Their survival was a testament to human endurance, organizational capability, and technological application. It was also a warning about the limits of those capabilities, a warning that would go unheeded with catastrophic consequences. The Demyansk pocket, 100,000 surrounded, 72 days isolated, survival through airlift. An unprecedented achievement that created a dangerous illusion. A success that seeded future disaster. A story of survival that became a cautionary tale about overconfidence and the limits of military power.